In the webinar, we'll be as interactive as we can be. So I'll ask you questions, and if you'd like to type into that chat box and give your answers, that would be amazing. Equally, if you just want to relax, listen, watch, read, that's absolutely fine. And do remember that all the slides will be available after the webinar, so you won't need to make loads of notes or anything. And there's also a recording afterwards, so don't worry about that. Let's press on then. So in this webinar, this is what we'll be looking at in the next hour or so. So first of all, we're going to examine what speaking is. What is speaking skills? Then we're going to look at the sub-skills of speaking, all those little bits that make up speaking. And then third, finally, we'll explore how to approach speaking skills in the classroom and look at some classroom activities there. That's going to be the bulk of the webinar. We've got a lot to get through in that section. So let's start. So our first one is to examine what speaking is. And here in this lovely picture, we've got 4 different strands of rope, 4 different colours. They're all independent, they're all separate, they're all doing their own thing, but they're all linked and joined in some way. And this to me is just like the skill of speaking. It's one of the 4 language skills we've got. We've got reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So we've got the 4 skills there, all separate, and yet they all interact together. And when we practice one of those skills, all 4 of them are developed, all of them are improved. So it's really important to pay attention to speaking skills just as much as reading and writing and listening. And how do the skills interact? We could say different ways. Reading and writing go together. Writing is often the output task after we've done a reading text in class. Listening and speaking go together. Speaking is often the output task after listening to a bit of audio in class. We can put reading and listening together because they're the receptive skills, they're receiving that input, they're passive. Or we could put speaking and writing together because they're the output skills, the active skills. There's a production of language. And I tend to think out of these 4 skills, I kind of think that speaking is the most neglected skill. I wonder if it's because it's the medium we use in class generally. We say hello, we check our comprehension answers, 1B, 2C. We tend to use English, but we don't always devote enough class time to it. So it is a little bit neglected. And it's also the most exposed skill. So if you think about written homework, the student writes it, hands it to you. Generally, no one else sees it in the class. Whereas with speaking, everyone can hear every single sound you make. So it is a more exposed skill, which can make people feel very vulnerable, obviously, as students. Let's have a think about what the sub-skills of speaking are. So all those little bits that make up speaking. So, for example, phonology would be one of those. So could I ask you, what do you think are the sub-skills of speaking? What do you think? Pronunciation, fluency, intonation, interaction with children, speed, lovely ideas. Language functions, that's a good one. Grammar, pitch. There's a lot, fantastic ideas. Structure, role plays, interpretation, creativeness. I love that. Yeah, great. Accuracy. Yeah, wonderful ideas. Thank you so much. Brilliant answers. And here are some more ideas. It's absolutely not an exhaustive list. In a perfect world, I'll be able to take all of your ideas and put them on the board, and we could proceed with a huge, beautiful list together. But this image just picks up a few key ones. So we've got non-verbal cues, all those facial expressions we make, or our body language. We've got phonology, people have already said pronunciation. Someone said language systems, and yes, we've got lexical resources there, grammatical resources, we've got functional language, we've got phonology, and right at the bottom, we've got self-confidence. At the bottom, but in no way the least important. The title of this webinar, as you know, is Speaking Skills for Confident Communication. And in that sense, confident communication, to me, it's someone who they've got the ability to take part in a spoken situation because they've got the linguistic resources to do so, so they know the language, or they've got the communication strategies, so they know how to deal with the situation when they don't have the language, or they've got the experience. They've spent a long time speaking the language, and so they're comfortable with that chat. And one more point I'd like to draw your attention to, that's cognitive processes in white down the right-hand side of that image. And I'd like to ask you 2 questions before we look at cognitive processes. Are you ready for question 1? Question 1, how many L1 words do we produce per second? So in your first language, how many words do we produce per second? Have a guess. 2 to 3 is the first guess. 5, 7, 3, 20. That's a lot of words. 4, 3, 1, 100. 2 to 3, a few words. So I think most of you are maybe between 2 and 5. Is that right? I think so. So the answer I have from a study by Ross in 2002 is 2 to 3 words per second, or 3 to 5 syllables, which is amazing, incredible amount of words. Your next question, question 2. How many L1 words, so your first language, how many words are in an adult lexicon? Just the average adult. 2.5, 10,000, 500, 100,000, 4,000. These are lovely guesses, lovely ideas. So I think everybody's in the thousands. Yep, super guesses. Do a couple more seconds just so everyone's got a chance to type it in. Around, ooh, someone said around 30,000. Well, that's my cue to stop then and tell you that the study from Ross, 2002, 30,000 words in the average adult lexicon, which is a huge amount of words. I'm sure you'll agree. Let's look at how this processing happens and how those figures play out with this little model. So this is a Levett's model of L1 speech production. So we can see we've got 3 stages to this model. Right at the very top, we've got the conceptualizer, and that's just a concept. There's no word at this time. It's just an idea, just a thought about what we might say. So it's pre-verbal. Then this concept, this idea goes into the formulator, that middle box. And this is where it starts to become a word now. So we, the brain, grabs the word, selects it from the lexicon. So that's our warehouse of words. And then with that selected word, the word is grammatically encoded. We apply all the grammar we need for it. It's phonologically encoded. So we know the sounds we need to make to produce that word correctly. And then this is still subconscious, still automatic, still pre-verbal. Then finally, we're out and into the articulator stage where that word becomes actual speech and spoken output, which to me is quite an amazing process, quite amazing. Let's have a look at how this is for L1. So let's have a look at how this has been slightly adapted, this model, but bilingual. And in this sense, for this study, it's not a bilingual in the sense of someone who has grown up with 2 languages equally from birth. This is for a competent L2 user. So all of our attendees here today. So this adaptation is just on the formulator stage and the lexicon. So for the formulator, the conclusion, the hypothesis is that there's one formulator for each language, just a separate function there. The lexicon for the second language, there's 3 stages now within it. So remember I said it's selecting from the 30,000 words, we're selecting just one word. And this is broken down into 3 stages of selection, 3 sub-stages if you like. So that grey box around the outside, that's for dormant words. So they're ones that are in the long-term memory, they're not part of production, they're there hanging around, but we're not going to use them. Number 2, the second stage, that's that yellow box there, they're active words. So they might well be selected, they're potential words. And then green, the smallest box, white in the middle, that's the selected word, the word that we have chosen to say and selected. So there's an incredible amount of processing within the processing. There's lots and lots going on here. And my reason for showing you both of these models is to just express that there is a lot going on. It's a complex and sophisticated skill, speaking. I said before, it's a neglected skill, so I really think we need to give it the respect, the time, and the attention that it needs. And let's look at how you can give it the time and attention and respect that it needs. So in this next section, we're going to go through 8 different points of how to approach speaking skills and look at some classroom activities. So for each of those points, I'll either give you something to think about afterwards and take away, or an activity you can use with your class, or an example from a course book. So, as we're here at the festival, I'd like to suggest we use the word festival and each of its 8 letters as an acronym to frame the 8 points we're going to look at. So we're going to look at one way or technique to develop your students' speaking, and the name of that technique will begin with the first letter of the name of that technique will begin with each of these letters. So first up, we've got the letter F, which stands for fluency and accuracy, because there's no way we can have a webinar about speaking and not mention fluency and accuracy. It's a huge topic, huge. It's its own webinar, it's its own course in itself. It's absolutely massive. So we're just going to look at an aspect of that in today's session. And I'd like to ask you 2 questions. Here's your first one. What is the aim of a fluency activity? So when you're doing a speaking task in class, what's your aim? To feel at ease? Lovely, I like that one, yes. To communicate, to speak with confidence, even with mistakes? Lovely answer. Communication, flow of language, reduce pauses in speaking, give them confidence. Oh, these are fantastic. Communication and creativity again, yes. More confidence, speed, absolutely. Excuse me. Inclusion, lovely. I love all of those answers. Thank you. Let me move on to the next question, if I may. So question 2, what is the aim of an accuracy activity? To be understood clearly and correctly, pronunciation, to be accurate, interpret grammar, absolutely. Get it right, that's right. Word stress, use the words properly, correct usage, clear and correct, lovely. To be understood clearly, that's a nice one, yes. Use of specific vocabulary, super. These are lovely, lovely, lovely answers. Thank you so much. Brilliant, brilliant. So again, if we were together, I could put these ideas on the board and we'd have a working definition and description of the 2 terms. But for now, if that's okay, let's use these ones. So for fluency, fluency activity, the aim would be to continue speaking at a natural pace with clarity, relative ease, and minimal interference. And I think there was a point there in the chat box that said something about ease. Fantastic. And minimal interference just means, remember, think about a time when you're talking to somebody and you're listening to them, but they're hesitating a lot, or they're repeating themselves, or they're jumping all over the place and there's a complete lack of coherence. Anything like that that causes coherence for the listener, we don't want that, obviously, for fluency. For accuracy, the aim then is to orally produce very specific and error-free target sounds or language. It might just be a sound, the schwa sound. That's it. Let's look a little closer at these 2 and examine the characteristics between fluency activities and accuracy activities. So we've got 4 categories here. To the left, we've got errors, teacher to student interaction, duration, the time of the activity, and quantity of the output from the activity. So if we look at errors, and we'll just say that that's any incorrect language. So in fluency, we're kind of permitting all errors. That's fine. Our interest is just producing a lot of speech. Errors are not important. Accuracy is not important. Whereas in an accuracy activity, we don't want any errors. We want to be eliminating them as much as possible. Teacher to speaker interaction, that next category. So in fluency, there's not going to be a lot of intervention from the teacher. You're going to be quiet and allow the student to carry on with their activity. For accuracy, you're going to intervene a fair amount, aren't you? If there's a wrong sound or wrong grammatical tense, you need to correct it on the spot and do it there. That's the purpose of an accuracy activity. So in terms of the duration of the activity, they're a little bit opposite again now. So fluency, it's going to be an extended activity. It's going to take a longer amount of time. Accuracy, it could be super short. It could just be 5 minutes working on some sounds or some word stress. That's it. And the last point there is quantity of output. So it's going to be larger in fluency. There's going to be multiple sentences said by the student. It could be into minutes of talking. Accuracy, super short, really small. It could just be a sound. Simple as that. Let's have a look at some examples of a fluency activity and an accuracy activity from a course book. So this is, firstly, let me say you don't need to read this in detail. Don't worry, please. This is from Speak Your Mind Students Book Starter Level. And this is a spread showing a complete lesson. So on the left, we've got a reading section on the top. On the left again, at the bottom, we've got a vocabulary section. That's picking out the words from the reading. Over onto the right-hand page, we start with pronunciation, and that's on word stress, picking up the words from the vocabulary. Then we're down into grammar to pick up the subject pronouns and the to-be statements, which is the point of this, one of the target language points of this lesson. And then at the end, we've got a speaking activity there. And I just wanted to show you this as a full spread so you can see the amount of space and time dedicated to speaking. It is, as I said at the beginning, it's just as important as all the other skills. So it warrants the space on the page and it warrants the time in your class. Let's have a look at these two speaking activities in a bit more detail. So here's the pronunciation one that was just highlighted. I'll give you a couple of seconds to have a read of that, and then we can talk through it together. So for this one, as you can see, we're looking at syllables, stress patterns. We've got a small number of words because we're at A1 plus level, starter level. And A and B, both of these activities are about the receptive stage. So we're giving students plenty of opportunity just to listen, just to absorb that sound, to notice the pattern, and to have that raising of awareness of these sounds. What's a really nice thing to do is maybe to ask your students to listen and mouth the sounds, or think about the sounds and just say them to themselves, sort of almost under their breath. So they're just practicing. They've got a little self-rehearsal, just a bit of practicing with the shape of the mouth and trying to sync with the word they've just heard. That's a really nice technique to get them to do that. Activity B, as I say, is another noticing stage there. It's raising awareness of the patterns. The patterns match the ones in activity A. So we're starting to build those neural networks between words, all of which helps. And then activity C, another listening. And then right at the end, we've got the production stage. And this is where the students are going to produce those sounds. So can I ask you, is this activity about fluency or accuracy? Accuracy is the first answer from Kine. I hope I've said that correctly. Accuracy, accuracy. We've got lots of A's. Is everybody saying accuracy? I think so. And oh, there's a fluency in there. That's interesting. I'll come back to that in a moment. Great. Okay. So let's say this is accuracy. So we are looking, this particular activity, we're looking for the stressed syllable. Must be exact. We can't have the wrong syllable stressed. Let's have a look at the other speaking activity from that lesson. And this is the one at the bottom of the page. So it's going to be the final stage of the lesson. I'll give you a couple of seconds to just have a quick skim read of this one, and then we'll go through this one together. So in this one, let me talk you through. We can see that activity A is the preparation stage. It's completing that pink ID card there. And the students have already had a model of the ID card from the reading section at the beginning of that lesson. So they've got the model there. Then we've got activity B and C are the semi-controlled practice stages there. So talking about your ID card with your partner. And there's also a little bit of input there to self-correct if you make a factual error. And that input is shown in the confident communicator speech bubble box there. That's a feature of Speak Your Mind, and it deals with these communication strategies when there's an error in the language or there's some sort of breakdown of communication, and that's going to fix it. So another question for you, is this activity about fluency or accuracy? This is testing both. Ooh, that's interesting. So lots of people are saying both, and lots of people are saying fluency. Fluency, 80%. That's a very precise statistic. Thank you. I missed your name, I'm afraid. Okay, so I wrote this, and my intention was definitely that it would be either fluency or accuracy. It's up to the teacher to tweak and have a think about how they want to do it. For me, I think I would approach this as fluency with a little slice of accuracy to the side, because we've just done that work on word stress, remember, 2 activities ago. We worked on word stress for for nationalities and countries, so nationalities and languages, sorry. So now when students are using those words within this fluency activity, I want those words to be accurate. So you can do a little bit of both. And it's important to remember that fluency activities can have that element of accuracy. You can hone in and listen for those points. And equally, all of those accuracy activities really, really play their part in the fluency. Because when the sounds are correct, when the word stress is right, when the sentence stress is correct, you've then got that lovely rhythm of speaking and that correct way of going. And that's going to really massively contribute to fluency. So fluency and accuracy. Let's move on to our next letter in the festival acronym, and that's E for error correction. And again, this is incredibly closely related to fluency and accuracy. And it's another huge topic as well. And again, we're just going to look at an aspect of it today. And errors here, we're just going to very simply say it's an incorrect example of language. So it could be incorrect because lexically, the wrong word is used, grammatically, the wrong tense is used, phonologically, the wrong sound, stress, intonation are used, or it's pragmatically, there's a pragmatic error. There's some sort of disobedience of social norms. You're interrupting someone too much, you're not turn taking, something like that. And also, I tend to think of errors as being two categories. There's an error now, so for the language you've just presented in your lesson, it's new language and it's wrong. Or it might be an old error. So it's a fossilized error. It's been there for months, for years. The student has somehow accepted that language as being the correct way when it isn't. And that's a harder error to get rid of, but we see them a lot. So I'd now like to give you a sentence and ask you to complete it for me. So errors mean the L2 student 1, fails to learn, 2, is learning. Have a think and type a number in the box. Lots of 2s? Oh, we've got no 1s so far. 2, oh, there's some both. Lots of 2s. Okay, lovely. Well, I did see, Andres has said both, and I could be both. The names went quite quickly. I did see a couple of people say both, and actually I'm going to be very, very naughty and say that I think it's both. So errors mean the L2 student failed to learn, but also errors mean the L2 student is learning. And I'm saying that because of the two types of errors I just mentioned. But if it's a word that is in your target language for the lesson and it's being used incorrectly, maybe that's just because the student, to me, it's just a way of trying it out, of playing with that new bit of language. It's a natural way of learning a new skill. So it's kind of not incorrect, it's on the way to being correct. It's a work in progress. Do you know what I mean? Whereas we can also say errors mean if students fail to learn. And that would be a fossilized error that I just mentioned. The one where a student is continually, repeatedly using the wrong grammatical tense for a particular concept. So I think it's a little bit of both. I would also say that I absolutely love errors. They're amazing data for the teacher. We can learn so much. We know where they are on their learning journey. We know what we've got to feed in, what we've got to correct. So amazing data. And certainly if you've got a new class, a really great activity is to just have a fluency spoken activity and just observe, monitor, note down those errors. What are the common errors for the class? What are the individual errors that individual students are making? And have a think. And these are 6 types of corrective feedback that you can give when you hear those errors. And these are all pretty much ones that we'd use on the spot. The student makes a mistake and boom, we've corrected it straight away. So we've got six ones mentioned here by Lister and Ranta. So let's go through these. We've got number 1 is explicit, and that's just where the teacher says the language is wrong. Number 2, a recast. So that's where the student says, for example, I go running yesterday, and the teacher will say, I went running yesterday. So the teacher repeats the sentence and corrects it for them. The correct model is supplied. Number 3, elicitation. That's where the teacher questions the error or repeats the sentence up to the error point. So with the example, I go running yesterday, the teacher would say, and hopefully the student would notice that the next word probably isn't correct. So could I change the tense? And is able to notice and self-correct. And if they do self-correct, you then got that uptake of language to show the correct form is there. Next up, we've got metalinguistic clues. So this is where the teacher comments on the error and provides information. So in that example I gave you about I go running yesterday, the teacher would say, no, that's the wrong tense. We use the past simple form of the verb for completed actions in the past. So they wouldn't actually give the correct language, but they'd give an explanation in a metalinguistic way to correct the student. Next up, clarification request. And this is simply where the teacher would ask about the concept of the question. So for that student who says, I go running yesterday, the teacher could say, when did you go running? And again, hopefully the student will correct. And the last one, repetition. So this is where the teacher repeats the error and highlights it in some way, perhaps with a raised voice. So if the student says, I go running yesterday, the teacher would say, I go running yesterday. So from these 6 examples, I know I've definitely used most of them, or I've observed them. Could I ask which ones you use? All of them, Claudia, well done. Recast, elicitation, recast, all of them. 5, a mix. Yeah, it does depend on the situation. Someone just said, absolutely, yes. Yeah, that's fantastic. And one that I love to use, I guess it's a combination of repetition and recast, is a finger correction. So, I go running yesterday. I go, and you highlight to the student that it's this word in the sequence. I is fine, running is fine, yesterday it's fine, but it's this one that's the problem. That's something that I use and I find very effective. These are all, as I've said, examples for on the spot. But let's look at examples of how we'd correct errors at a later stage. So maybe if we're doing a fluency activity, we'd have a very simple way of noting errors like this. So let's have a look at these. We've got in the left-hand column, the example of the error, the language that's wrong. Then in the middle, the feedback from the teacher, and then an optional extra question at the end, correct language. So first of all, we've got he go to college. And then we've got 2 ways of dealing with that feedback. You can actually just recast, give the straight answer. He goes to college. Or you could underline it and describe what the error is, using that metalinguistic clue. Verb form tense is wrong. And you can maybe write that little tiny sentence there, a little exercise for the student. He gap to college. You can also pick up on pronunciation like this. So if a student has said, my village is beautiful, no, with the feedback, and we can say this is a B sound, not W. And right at the bottom, no errors in this. It's an example that says, I'm really into water sports. And there's a tick for the good language. So the word order is good. There's be plus intensifier and there's into. Another tick for really accurate use and great intonation by the student, for example. And I've added this one in because I'd certainly like to encourage you to feedback on all the language that your students offer to you. It's important that we recognise we're listening to all of that output and we're paying attention to it. So yes, absolutely correct the errors, note them down in whatever way. But also, if you've heard a great bit of language, if they're using some new language well, if there's a very difficult grammatical concept that they've expressed, then we need to applaud it. Absolutely. Positive reinforcement is so important. So I would encourage you to try that. Let's move on to the next letter in the festival. So we are now on S, for student talking time. So this may sound like a really silly and obvious point to make, but your students do need to be speaking. Just like I showed you in that lesson, the spread from the starter of the lesson pages, we need to dedicate a good chunk of your lesson to speaking. Give the students the time and the opportunity to speak properly. Do it. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points here, which will help you to increase the student talking time. So right at the top at 12 o'clock, we've got maximize the material. So this is thinking about what's ready in your lesson, what's in the course book that you're doing. Is there, for example, in the reading text, an extra discussion question that you can ask your students for a little bit of fluency practice? Or in that listening, was there a really interesting bit of intonation that you could do with your students to get a little bit of accuracy practice, a bit of intonation work? Or maybe the vocabulary has some quite tricky words in it, and you need to look at some specific vowel sounds, some consonant clusters, some word stress. What can you do to grab all of those speaking opportunities that you can? And one perfect way to do it, the next bubble down to the right, no L1. So it's absolutely true that now and again, yes, you should maybe speak your first language with the students, assuming you all share that same first language. But as a general rule of thumb, I'd urge you not to. I don't know how many hours your students are with you or how much exposure they get to English, but whilst they're there in the lesson with you, it needs to be all in English whenever you can, even with lower levels. Try for it. Next bubble down, we've got teacher talk time. And in that box, there should be a down arrow to say that teacher talk time decreasing. So just be honest with yourself and think, do I do a bit too much talking? Do I take a bit of lesson time? Be honest about it, and that's fine if you do. Just work on turning it down a bit. Or you could ask your students if they wouldn't mind you recording a lesson, and then you'll be able to see and observe for yourself how much of that time you're speaking and how much you needed to be speaking. So next round on the bubble, we've got speaking outside of class. So just like with reading and writing and listening, we want our students to be practicing and working on all the skills, not just in class, in the lesson, but outside as well, which is a big one, and we'll come back to that point in a second. And the last one, last but by no means least, autonomy. I think it's really, really important to get your students to buy in and to commit to speaking. Give them that accountability and that responsibility, so you can maybe set them goals. So this week, I'm going to contribute in every class discussion, or I will only speak English, no L1 in my lesson, or I will work on my B and W sounds. Whatever it is, just some little goal and aim to help them. So let's go back and revisit that speaking outside of class. And let me ask you, what speaking practice could you ask your students to do outside of class? Or what speaking practice do you already ask your students to do out of class? Speaking clubs, oh, lovely. Survey, chatting with online gamers, that's nice. Reflect during meetings in a cafe, record themselves, calling a hotel to ask for information, perfect, I love that. Survey in English, put Netflix on in English, wonderful. YouTube videos, amazing, I love these ideas. Yeah, Zoom breakout rooms, brilliant. Video recording, singing in the shower, that's amazing, I love that one. That's brilliant. Oh, again, I want to write them all down and put them on a board and create a massive, beautiful list of fantastic activities. So I've got a tiny list of practice activities for you here. There's brilliant ones in the chat box as well going on. So we've got, just to quickly run through these, recording a conversation with a classmate, phoning your teacher and leaving a voicemail. There was one in the chat box about phoning a hotel to ask for information. Fantastic. We can role play and record a dialogue from the audio script. Read a text aloud and record it. That could be a text from a graded reader, a text from your course book, a tweet, a Facebook message, anything. Learn a short clip or a lip sync from a song or a movie. Send an audio message to the class WhatsApp group. Make a personal video diary, and then work together to write and present a skit for class. So a skit is a short dramatic performance. It could be a poem, it could be a 4-line dialogue, as big or as it could be a Shakespearean play if they want. It's just getting students to work together and create a mini project. So I'm still reading all of your brilliant suggestions. They're fantastic in the chat box. Thank you. I think my favourite, I love the singing in the shower from the chat box. That's such a great idea. I also love video diaries. I think these are really great because what do I like about these? I think because it's a video diary, we can see their facial expression, their body language. So just like we're in person, it gives you those added elements, those sub-skills we spoke about at the beginning for speaking. We've got that already. It's completely non-threatening because it's just between you and the student, teacher and student. No one else needs to see it. So it's fine. It's really safe and non-threatening. And also because it's between you and the student only, you've got that one-to-one interaction together. And I imagine most of your class sizes aren't always small. So if you've got a bigger class, this is a really nice way of getting to know that individual student, finding out a bit more about them. And the video diary can be, it's on anything, up to them. So it could be their cat, it could be having an interview in their brother in the kitchen, it could be showing you their wardrobe in their bedroom, just anything. It doesn't matter, as long as they're just producing English, thinking English, and just that commitment and that habit to start using English more in the spoken way outside of class time. Let's now move on to our next letter. So we've done F, fluency and accuracy. We've done E, error correction. We've done S, student talking time. Next up is T for, any ideas what T could stand for? Teacher talk time, TTT again, thinking, talking. And there we have it, topics. I think someone picked that up. Fantastic. So I'm going to start straight away with a question. And my question is, which topics are good for practicing speaking? What do you think? Make a couple little notes in the chat box. Nationalities, food. Someone said any. Interesting answer. Free time, my favorite singer, storytelling, cultures. Brilliant. I love all of these. Give you a few more seconds for these, and then I'll give you my answer. Lovely. Thank you. So I noticed someone said interesting topics I like, and someone said any earlier. And any is my answer as well. So it's any, but there is an asterisk there. And that asterisk says within reason. And that's simply to remind you that we can't talk about, if there's a topic that's insensitive or upsetting for your students, then don't talk about it in class. And that simply reflects real life. We don't start a conversation with a friend and then bring up a topic that we know will upset them. So just to bear that in mind. And the massive, massive advantage you have with teaching your own class is that you will know them well, or you can get to know them well and find out what they're into, what topics they want to talk about, what topics they don't want to talk about. You can get to know them fantastically well. So what might you do to practice these topics? So this beautiful state-of-the-art innovative grid is something you can use to practice fluency, for example. So for this, a couple of ideas for what you could do with this grid. You could write, so there's 20 squares there in total. So you could write a topic or a statement in each of the squares and then cut that up into 20 individual squares or cards. Then give 4 to 5 cards to each of your groups and ask them to choose 3 topics to talk about. And it's really important that they have more cards than they need to talk about, because then they've got that element of buying in, of choosing, of selecting, of being responsible and taking accountability. Yeah, I want to talk about this, but I don't want to talk about finance. Thank you very much. So they've got that element of negotiation going on, and it's quite natural. And they're doing that negotiation, they're doing that speaking before the speaking activity has already started. So you're getting a lot of good work out of that before the activity starts. And then when they've chosen their 3 cards, they've got their topics to talk about. They could talk about the topic for a minute, they could ask each other questions, various ways of how you'd like to run that. And you could also give them an extra blank card and ask them to choose their own topic. Another thing you could do with this grid is to adapt it to become a board game. So you could simply put start and finish at opposite ends, and then put your topics in the middle, or ask students to fill in their own topics, and you've got a super board game. Or you could make an amazing, beautiful, creative snakes and ladder game, and again, add the topics, ask students to put in their own topics. It can be as complicated, as creative, as simple, whatever you want. The final quick thing I'll mention for this one is that you could cut the grid in half, so you've got 10 squares. Then you need to ask your class 10 questions. They must work alone and write the answer in any of those 10 boxes. So the questions need to produce quite a short answer. So something like, what's the name of a sports person you really admire? And the student would write in there, Usain Bolt, whoever they admire, in a square. Carry on till you've done your 10 questions, and then students work together in pairs, and they can go through their answers talking about all those 10 points. Or, again, you could introduce that element of choice. And so when they're in pairs, ask the partner to say, 1, 2, 3, 4, those answers, tell me about those 4. I'm not interested in the others. So you've got that interaction there. And from that, you could actually move that into a pyramid discussion. And so the pair becomes a group of 4, pairs swap within groups of 4, and you could get an enormous amount of good spoken activity from this. Let's move on to our next letter. So we're now at letter I. And can I ask you any ideas towards this one, what I might stand for? Interest, imagination, interaction. Oh, we have a winner. That was Katya, I think. Thank you, Katya. Straight in there, wonderful. So the next one is interaction. And so these 3 points here, there we are. These all have an indirect impact on the success, the enjoyment of the spoken activities in your classroom. The first point, just to think about the physical classroom. I know most of us are online at the moment, but just to bear in mind that as and when we get back to face, these 2 shapes of classroom seating that we've got in the blue are super common and just fantastic for language. So we've got the horseshoe, that semicircle shape. That's great because everyone can see everyone. The teachers at the front, round the back, wherever. It's a nicely laid out classroom, and it's easy to move students around there. And then on the right, we've got a sort of row system, pairs of seats. That's also great because you can do pair work here, pair work with the person behind you. You can work in a group of 3, a group of 4. It's quite naturally grouped together for pair work. It might be a bit more difficult to physically get a student up and move 4 seats away, but it's still a very positive arrangement. The next point, teacher to student. And that's thinking about your physical position in the classroom and the impact that that has on the lesson. So again, this is talking about in a physical classroom rather than online. So if you're standing at the front and looming over your students, or standing right next to them when they're trying to use a new word and they're feeling a bit awkward, it might help them, it might not. Just be aware of that. Maybe it's better for you to sit back quietly away to one side and stay out of the action so that they can speak. And as long as you can hear what's going on, that's fantastic. And then last but not least, student to student interaction. So we know it's best practice to rotate students, to get each student in the group speaking to hopefully everybody else in the group as well, ideally. Why not? The more, the more the merrier, fantastic. Within that, obviously bear in mind that some students will be happy talking to others, some won't. Just like real life, there are people we enjoy speaking to and others we don't. So be aware of that dynamic as well. And one thing, just thinking about students talking to other students, can I ask you, have you experienced a time when students say that they don't want to do a spoken activity, or they're very reluctant to do a speaking activity? Is that something that happens? Yes. Yes, yes. There's a lot of yeses. Thank you for your answers. And this is an example of 2 responses that you might have from your students. These are 2 that I've certainly heard on a number of occasions. So I don't want to speak to other students, and I need grammar and vocab. Another one might be, I'm too shy, but maybe that student won't want to actually say those words to you. And we'll talk more about the emotional side in a later letter of our festival acronym. We'll come back to that in a moment. So it's really difficult when students say this because we must listen to them and we must address their concerns. Absolutely. We must also therefore just explain the value of speaking to them. And here are some responses that I find quite useful to give to students to explain and just promote speaking. So speaking is one of the 4 language skills. We spoke about this a bit at the beginning: reading, writing, listening, speaking, and all of them being, yes, absolutely independent, doing their own thing, but together, bigger, better, stronger. Improve one skill and all the skills will improve. We can't neglect speaking, or any of them. Speaking activates and consolidates new language because it's allowing that learner to practice, to produce, to teach, to hear, to correct, to praise. It needs to happen. It's evidence of that learning. Speaking is a social skill and a life skill, not just a linguistic skill. Yes, because we're building, when we speak to somebody, we're building relationships, whether it's friends, colleagues, it's a building, networking, social skill. Speaking allows the teacher to check your learning progress. So is there something that your student's saying and maybe you need to go back over something, maybe you need to do that again, or maybe everything is fine. It's a great way, again, of just having that data and assessing it as a teacher. Speaking develops the overall language competence of the LT user. Absolutely. It's there to, these little things all contribute to the overall competence. And last but not least, again, this is a fantastic statistic, I think. 75%, that's a lot, of English interaction is non-native speaker to non-native speaker. So someone whose first language is German, who is speaking English with someone whose first language is Japanese. 75%, way more than non-native speaker to native speaker. So asking your students to talk to other students in class is really replicating real life and preparing them for using English outside. It's an amazing statistic. It's essential. Let's move on to our next letter. And I'm going to just tell you what that one is, because I've been a little bit cheeky. I'm sorry. And I've gone for V as vowels, but vowels, vowel sounds, diphthongs, phonemes, pronunciation. I've squeezed it out and stretched it a bit because I wanted to include pronunciation, because we can't talk about speaking without talking about pronunciation. It's about accuracy, it contributes to fluency, and it's about confident communication. So another question for you, if I may. So can I ask, how often do you include pronunciation in any of its forms in your classes? So from 1, not very often, to 10 in every lesson. There should be a 10 at the end of that arrow on the right. Could you give me your numbers? Oh, there's lots of 10s, 8s, 1s, every class, very often. Great. That's a really interesting mix of numbers. Thank you. Great. Lots of 10s. I love that. I'm loving the high numbers. Great. So for those of you who are maybe 5 and under, could I perhaps tempt you, a bit like when I asked you to maybe think about asking your students to make a goal for autonomy and to increase their student talking time. Could I ask you to make a goal and think, okay, in the next week, in the next 2 weeks, I'm going to include an extra pronunciation slot. Could you do that? I think that would be lovely. Let's look at what pronunciation consists of and what that means when we're talking about pronunciation. Whew, it's a big list. So in this word cloud, it's all of these things and more, isn't it? It's connected speech. I'm going to make a pizza. It's syllables. We looked at that earlier with the word stress for countries and nationalities. It's sound. It's intonation, whether we rise or fall. It's a phoneme or it's a diphthong. It's 2 phonemes put together, A or O. It's schwa, the sound. It's stress. It's consonant clusters. It's contractions, I'd. It's elision. It's dropping those words out, pulling them together. It's filler words. It's all of these things. But basically, if you forget all of those, it's very simply how we say something. You can ignore all those terms and all the words. Ignore all of that and just think it's how we say something correctly. And we're not aiming for, I don't know, some perfect pronunciation, whatever that is in your head. We're not aiming for that. We are only aiming for intelligibility. So that simply means we want the listener to understand the words you're saying. That's it. And that's what I'd urge you to think of for your aim for pronunciation. Let's look at a couple of examples of pronunciation. So here, this is from Speak Your Mind Students Book Level 3. So that's B1 level. So the examples we looked at earlier were pre-A1, A1. So this is quite a few steps up now in the language learner journey. So I'll give you a couple of seconds just to read through those, and then we'll talk through them together. Okay, so let's look at the top one. And this is syllable stress again, and we're in multi-syllable polysyllabic adjectives. So all of these words the students have already met in the reading, so they're not new words. They're there for a reason. The students need to know how to say them. So here, this could simply be, I don't know, 2-3 minutes of your class time. There's a listening stage, so students have got that receptive stage, so important. Is that raising awareness, noticing of patterns, and you could leave it like that, or you could extend the activity, and maybe what could you do here? You could look at the bull endings in capable and preventable. You could draw attention to that silent letter E. We don't pronounce that one, but we insert a schwa between the B and the L. You could extend it a bit if you want. You could add in other words with similar suffix endings and just start creating those neural networks. What about the pronunciation at the bottom? That's a bit different. That's for fuller sounds and words. So hopefully you'll be able to read those 4 items there within activity A. If you count, the fuller sounds are number 1, number 2, number 3, you know, and number 4. It's like, and I love these features because I think it's so normal. It's real life. It's what we do when we're speaking. And in fact, the second activity, activity B in that example, asks you about your language, your first language, and what filler sounds and words you use. So it's a really great personalization activity after that. Let's move on to our next, and that's the list. And any guesses what A might be for? Accuracy, audience. Oh, that's a lovely one, audience. I love that. Action, autonomy, beautiful. Accuracy. Okay, I will tell you. So it's atmosphere. And let me ask you another question. Looking at this beautiful emoji on the slide, could I ask you, which adjectives would you use to describe the emotions that emoji is feeling? Happy, happiness, excuse me, friendly, joyful, cheerful, excited, pride, yeah. I haven't had them for that, cute. Yeah, happy and relaxed. And there's a shy, interesting. Okay, lovely, thank you. These are beautiful ideas. Thank you so much, great. So for this one, yeah, do your students feel like this emoji feels like in class? So is the atmosphere of your class friendly, supportive, welcoming, non-threatening? I hope so. That is my kind of place. That's what we want for our students. And remember at the start when I was saying we've got the 4 skills, reading, writing, listening, speaking, that I think speaking is the most exposed, the most vulnerable to students. And this picks up on exactly that. So the affective filter hypothesis, that suggests this is all about the emotional variables of our students. It suggests that a learner's ability to acquire language, to learn language, is reduced when they're experiencing negative emotions, such as fear, anxiety, or embarrassment. Makes perfect sense to me. And when they are experiencing those negative emotions, when they're not learning, that's when we say the affective filter is up. Just like a brick wall, where you're just stopping the bad negatives coming in, and you're also stopping the language coming in. So we want students affective filter down. We want them relaxed, happy, feeling supportive, feeling safe, feeling friendly, all of those things. So have a think in your classroom. How do your students feel? What can you do to improve things? See what you think. And now we're moving on to our last and final letter of festival. So it's the letter L. Any ideas for what that might stand for? Listening, love. Oh, very nice. Learning, language. Yes, so we've had a winner. So, and unfortunately, it went far too quickly. But yes, language is our last point that's important for speaking. And again, it's kind of an obvious one, but it's still worth talking about. We still need those 4 language skills: reading, writing, listening, speaking. We need them all to be worked on and all practiced. So ask your students to read more, ask them to listen more, ask them to write more, and that will lift up their speaking, just as speaking will lift up their writing, their listening, their reading. It's a balance of all those skills. Language is also about the very specific language that you need for that particular context that you end up in. whatever that is. So functional language. One of our comments earlier in the chat box about phoning a hotel to ask for information, for example. And another point with language is communication strategies. I mentioned this a while back, that it's those strategies where your student, there's a bit of a linguistic deficit. They don't have the language for that precise situation, sorry. So how do they deal with that? What language do they use, or what behaviors do they use to address that gap? This is an example of one of these communication strategies in action. This is from Speak Your Mind Students Book Level 3. So it's B1, B1+. So it's a higher level. And if you read through those 3 questions there in italics and the bits in bold, the language there that we're inputting. So what you're saying is that, the next one, am I right in thinking that? And then finally, if I understand correctly, you're saying that, so these 3 exponents are there to help students paraphrase, to check understanding. It's a super strategy because it shows that you've listened to your partner, you're pretty sure what they're talking about, but you're just going to check. And that's perfect, because then if what you think they've said is completely wrong, they have the opportunity to easily explain what they did mean. It's a great strategy, really great. And these strategies absolutely work. And this is proven by science. Let's have a look at some studies that suggest exactly this and why it's worth having in your lessons and in your course books. So, excuse me. So Dorney and Scott identified 3 types of communication strategies. They're there in brackets: direct, indirect, and interactive. I'll quickly explain those. So direct, as a communication strategy, that would be where a student hasn't got the language, and so they choose to move into their first language, or maybe they mime something instead. Indirect is where the student hasn't got the language, and they need to create better conditions in order to find that language. So maybe they'll use one of the fillers that we mentioned earlier to buy a bit of time. It's like some sort of strategy like that. And the final one, interactive, and that's where both speakers work together and interact to work out the meaning. So both of them are going to be re-explaining themselves, checking in with each other. What do you mean? Is that, and a little bit like the paraphrasing that we've just seen. So are you saying that it would be that type of strategy, an interactive one? So the reason teaching communication strategies is important is because you're going to get 3 fantastic benefits for your students. The first one, speaking skills increase. More confidence in communication. It's exactly what we want. Last but not least, greater self-awareness of language use. And this to me is the most interesting point, I think. And I've just referenced 2 studies at the bottom there, Zador and Robbins, 96, and Nakatini, 2003, 2005. There are loads of studies on communication strategies, but I love these 2 because these both have a very strong element of encouraging students to notice strategies, to actively, openly, explicitly state that they're learning strategies, and to ask them to notice their use of them. So in both of these studies, the students who received communication strategies practice and work were the best. On their test results at the end of each study, those students who received communication strategies performed better. And both of these studies asked students to fill in either a questionnaire, that was for Zador and Robbins, or a diary along the way of how they used, throughout the course, of how they use strategies, how often they use them. And both of these, as I've said, increased communication strategy use, but also both of these had increased awareness in the students. They took responsibility for what they were learning. They became a lot more aware of the language that they were using and the new language they put into practice, and it absolutely works. So please, please go for it. Include them in your lessons as much as you can. And so that brings us to the end. So in this webinar, we looked right at the beginning about what speaking is, what speaking skills mean. We looked at the sub-skills of speaking, that non-exhaustive list and all your amazing ideas of everything that's included in speaking. It's a huge, huge list. And we looked a little bit at the cognitive processes as well, in what is involved in speech production for L1 and also that adapted model for L2. And finally, we went through the approach to 8 different approaches to speaking skills and some classroom activities or examples from course books or things you could take away to do or things to think about. So if I can very quickly ask you now, for that last point, number 3, our 8 points of the speaking skills, we use the acronym FESTIVAL. So the first letter is F, and can you remember what F stood for? Fluency, thank you very much. And the next letter was E, what did that stand for? Error correction, excellent. Next letter, S. Student talk time, boom, super, thank you. Next letter, B. Topics, terrific. Next letter, I. Interaction, incredible. Next letter, V. Vowels, and that's my cheeky one. It's kind of vowels, but basically it's pronunciation. Next letter, A. Atmosphere, amazing. And then the final letter, the one we've just looked at, L. Language, lovely. Thank you so much. And thank you for your absolutely amazing contributions and ideas and suggestions. I've seen a few questions, but I've not been able to catch them and answer them. But thank you so much for attending and for your brilliant, brilliant questions and suggestions and enthusiasm. It's very much appreciated. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end. So Federica will no doubt join us shortly, and maybe we've got time for some questions, the ones that I missed. Hi. I can, yes, thank you. Hi, Federica. They're amazing.
Appreciated it.
Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. Brilliant.
So thank you so much, and thanks everyone for attending. Obviously, we definitely got a few questions if you have the time, Rhona.
Of course.
So there was, thank you. There was Elena asking, can we realistically do fluency activities with lower level learners, meaning A1 to A2? Because you're the expert.
Absolutely, Anna. I love this level. Oh, yes, definitely do fluency activities. But what I would say is that I think I mentioned on that chart that fluency, you're going to expect a greater output, a large number of sentences. So for lower levels, for A1, A2, if you get one sentence, that's fine, that's fluency practice. If they were able to say, I'm from Argentina, with everything, the word stress correct, the sounds correct, and it moving slowly through the sentence at a good pace, clear, that's great, that's fluency. So do feel free to adapt that definition and get it into just any simple sentence would be fantastic at that level.
Thank you. And Kani was asking about this. Do you think that a bigger vocabulary makes it easier for students to practice fluency and accuracy?
Oh, yeah, I love that question. And I don't know. I think in the research, it's a little bit contradictory, isn't it? So it could be either way. And I wonder if this is something that it's down to group differences and individual differences. So for one person within a group, it might really empower them because they've got they're very good with language anyway, or they're very confident speaker. So it's easy for them to get out all these fantastic words. But for another person, yeah, it might create some sort of confusion and some delay in selection. But I would say generally speaking, if I have to give an answer, I would definitely say it's going to help the more language you've got there, because also all of that language is interconnected. They're all linked together in that neural network. So if you know one word, you're going to know 10 words. You know, it's going to build together. It should be a strong, important thing for fluency.
Thank you. And someone else was asking, can fluency ever be isolated from accuracy, do you think?
Oh, so I'd say no, because I'm always listening a little bit for those individual sounds, but I'm sure some teachers would say absolutely yes, and wouldn't be as worried. And I think in its purest form, if we just want to say fluency, then absolutely it could be littered with errors and be very difficult to understand. But as long as it's that continued flow of speech, we could say that that's fluency practice. But as I say, I would be tempted to keep listening out and just maybe making a note of those errors and dealing with them afterwards.
Thank you. And quite a few questions came up about errors and mistakes. And people were asking, do you think it's better to interrupt students when they make mistakes in order to correct them, or not? And Miran was also asking, how can we work with fossilized errors, especially in B1 levels?
Oh, yes, yeah, this is, fossilized errors. Yeah, they're basically a nightmare, really, aren't they? I think they're such a challenge. And I think the way that I always go from is to make it clear that that's the error and it should be this, and to actually use that metalinguistic clue of explaining why. And in quite a boring way, setting some, if it's a grammar error, for example, setting some grammatical exercises that contrast the correct form and that incorrect form. So you're almost drilling that in and hoping to change it. But I would say for fossilized errors, it is a challenge, and it is going to take a long time to just reverse that way of thinking. So just keep on it as a teacher and get your students to commit and keep. You could also give them as an aim, or a little, it's just something for them to remember each lesson. This is something I always get wrong, so I've got to work super hard to remember that. It's a combination of teacher and student working together, I think, to sort that. And the first question you asked me, sorry, that was about, is it good to correct errors all the time?
Yeah.
Is
and interrupt
right?
students.
Yeah. And I think it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because it obviously can lead to some students feeling utterly demotivated. So if, for example, every word they said had an error, no, don't correct that. Let them get, just in a way, you want to prioritize the areas you're going for. So maybe today you're not going to think about the lexical ones, you're just going to concentrate on the phonological ones, for example, with a student. Maybe try to find some way of prioritizing to pick out which areas they are. And I'd say with accuracy and with errors, it's always, and particularly with students who may feel that they're being stopped all the time, and it's a bit like you're being told off and punished for using the language, which isn't what we want them to feel like. So I'd certainly say it's probably at the beginning of that activity saying to students, I will stop you when there's a sound, or would you like me to make a note of the sound that's wrong, the word that's wrong after? So you could work with them and decide how you're going to give that error. That might be a way then that just makes it softer and kinder, but still gets the instruction done for your students. And it's the prioritizing, yes, I think that.
That's a great tip, thank you. Someone else was also asking, how could I try my students to stop translating from their mother tongue, especially when they're at lower levels?
Oh, yeah. This is, and presumably, I guess that's a monolingual class, so everybody's, is it the same shared first language? That's very difficult, I think. I think you could use one of those autonomy goals and say, no L1 translation this lesson. And just slowly start to turn the dial. So if they speak to you in the L1, don't listen to them, ignore it, pretend you didn't hear anything. A little reward, a massive cheer when someone uses English. Any little tiny things you can do to just slowly start to shift that balance. But it will be, yes, it will be tough. It's one of those things that almost from day one, lesson one, you need to set those boundaries down and say, yes, it will be difficult, but it's in English.
You know what? It's the exact same thing that my teachers did with me. They just pretended that they didn't understand. I was one of those students. I got to the end of that course thinking that my teacher couldn't speak Italian. And then at the end of it, he came to me and said, congratulations, you did great in Italian. And I was like, oh, well then. So, I mean.
That's so funny.
There you go. That's where I heard it from. And I think one last question, because Rhona is also delivering another session this evening, and she delivered one already. So we just want you to get a little bit of breath before the next one. So one last question, and it was from Elena asking, how does the teacher assess and support students with fluency?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I would tend to do a sort of before and after. So at the beginning of the course, have a fluency activity, like one of those cards where they talk about a topic, you ask them some questions, and you record that. And then, I don't know how long the weeks, the course is, say it's 4 weeks. At the end of that 4 weeks, you can revisit that. re-record, have exactly the same topic, exactly the same question, and record it again and see if you've got that improvement then in terms of a reduction of the number of errors, that the duration is perhaps longer, and the output is better quality. So we've got more vocabulary in there, more grammatical structures, some super sounds, anything like that. So I think a before and after might be nice, because it's a very, very difficult language skill to quantify.
Thank you. It was absolutely amazing to have you. Thank you so much for staying over for the Q&A as well.
No, my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Federica, and thank you for putting this amazing festival. I think we're all just really enjoying it, so thank you.
It was absolutely our privilege to have you, so thank you, Rhona.